Hello and welcome to Inspire to Act from Thrive Ireland. This is Diane Holt.
And I'm Will Leach, and we're both back in Studio 2 at Commission Christian Radio. Our thanks to them for making us welcome. And this is where we make this podcast helping people of faith think about how they can make a difference in their own communities.
And thanks also to the Community Relations Council who are supporting Inspire to Act. So, we're back. And we had a great chat last time with Professor David Porter. He said so much, I'm still thinking about it.
I know, actually, me too. A great guest with loads to say. I have to be honest here, Diane. I asked a couple of rather smart alecky journalist questions, and he answered them so brilliantly and graciously. I kind of had to stop myself bursting into applause at the end. So thanks to David. If you hadn't had a listen to that interview yet, and I really would, the episode is the one before this one, and it's called Pick It Up.
So, I'd just like to give a big Thrive Ireland welcome to our guest this time, Dr. Leslie Carroll, who's blazed so many trails. I'm amazed she doesn't come with a fire warning. So welcome, Leslie.
Thank you, Diane.
Leslie, it's lovely to see you. Thanks for coming in. Yeah, when it comes to grappling with difficult issues, I have to say, you just seem to get right in there and do it. Peace, reconciliation, prisoner welfare and relations, being a Presbyterian minister for ages, and now a new role in investigating the past. But we'll get to all that kind of stuff later on.
I know this is a horrible question and it's like never ending, but tell us a bit about yourself. Just start at the beginning. So tell us a wee bit about where you grew up and where you were born, where you grew up.
I grew up a long time ago, Diane. I'm proud to say I was born in Cool Island in County Tyrone, which was a great and interesting place to grow up. We lived on the outskirts of Cool Island. I went to school in Dungannon. My grandmother lived in the village centre. Cool Island was then a village, it was probably as full of activity then as it is now, but it wasn't as substantial then as it is now. And my grandmother was one of the few Protestant families who lived within the bounds of Cool Island. So she was very happy there, actually, and we were very happy to visit and grow up there. From school, I went to college in Plymouth in England for 3 years, originally an Anglican college, so it had a certain ethos to it, but it had moved away from that Anglican education degree only kind of college to a college that integrated people from different parts of the world into different types of degrees, including humanities, which I did, studied religion and philosophy with sociology. That was kind of my 3 years out of Northern Ireland to get a different breath of air than I grew up in. Obviously, growing up in the Dungannon, Cool Island area in the 60s, 70s, 80s was a challenging time, shall we say. So the fresh air of Plymouth was interesting, different. Although the Falklands War was on at the time and the Harrier jump jets used to practice at the airport just behind the college. So it was a wee bit like home in that sense. And from there I came back to college in Belfast, to Union Theological College, the Presbyterian College, where I was for 3 years.
And had you always sort of had that inkling, or did you feel really called to become a minister?
No, not always, no. So I mean, we grew up in those days, there wasn't much else to do but church. Dungannon didn't have a cinema. It was the most bombed town in Northern Ireland when I was growing up. We did have a cinema for a short time, but it kept getting bombed, so we ended up not having one. So there wasn't anything much to do other than church activities. So we went to the Presbyterian Church in Dungannon for Christian Endeavour, Youth Club. We went to the Church of Ireland in Dungannon for badminton. We went to my home congregation in New Mills for some other things. We went to the congregation in Stewartstown for Girls' Brigade. So it was all around different kinds of churches. So we were sunk in that, if you like, and that was our life. And it was a great life. It really was. And I had no ambitions to be a minister because I didn't know I could be until probably I was about 16. And I remember vividly we were driving through Cool Island and just coming around the bank corner, which for anybody who lives in Cool Island will know the bank corner very well. For those of you who don't, it's like a hairpin bend. So you go around, cut back on yourself. And we were just cutting back on ourselves when Dad and Mum were talking about Ruth Patterson, who was the first female minister ordained in the Presbyterian Church in Ireland. And as we came round the corner, I said, I didn't know women could be ministers. And they said, yeah, well, they can. And I thought, that's it. That's for me.
You've talked about a family life where it was church-centred. You haven't talked about when the moment came when you thought, I'm a believer, I follow this Christ figure. And I'm fascinated by that, because was it always that this is just who I am?
Yeah, no, it isn't. It wasn't always this is who I am, although maybe it should have been, well, as I reflect back. So we were steeped in the faith mission, for example. New Mills Presbyterian Church had a small hall in Cool Island, the Foster Memorial Hall. And it was often used by the faith mission, and my grandmother looked after it for the faith mission. So we would have been at a lot of faith mission activities, and they were great. And again, we felt loved, we felt like we belonged, and that was so significant for that part of my life. But every faith mission event ends with an altar call, and I think I got saved 100 times. And if it wasn't there, it was at some mission. We would have gone maybe to a mission on a Sunday night after the evening service, or there would have been a mission in the congregation, or we'd have put on what we called a coffee bar, where, I remember as a young enthusiast for saving many other souls, sitting at coffee bar tables going, you're going to do it tonight, are you going to come to the Lord tonight? So I grew up in that very evangelical ethos where you intentionally gave your life. I can't give you a date because they were married, and yet there was no need, because it was also who I was in that sense. And when I say there was no need, that's not a theological statement. That's a statement about how I understood myself as belonging to God and being given to God, and as me having given myself to God. So that belonging mattered. But yes, there was that ethos around of making sure you were saved, being anxious that you weren't, repeating the prayer, giving yourself back to God, just in case.
The number of people who've said to me, I remember praying the prayer when I meant it and praying it when I didn't. And yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's a thing. You had said you didn't really believe you could be a minister, that women could be a minister. Did you feel like you were doing a brave thing when you went forward to become one, or that you were blazing a trail, or this is just what I'm doing?
I didn't at all feel like I was blazing a trail. That never entered my head. It was simply, yes, it was an open door. Well, that's okay. You just go through it. Now, I'm not suggesting that it was a flippant decision without any thought. It was a decision in that moment, but I greatly examined it afterwards to be absolutely certain that this was the direction I believed I should go in my life. So I've always asked myself, probably at times to my own detriment, or to, by that I mean almost paralysing myself with the question, is this where God wants me to go? So, I did examine it afterwards, but no, I never thought of myself as blazing a trail at all.
But there can't have been too many other women at Union at the time.
So by the time I got to Union College, so I interviewed when I was 19 and was accepted for when I was 19. I didn't come back, obviously, to Union College until after that. By the time I came into Union College, I was the only woman in the first year of theological training. In my second year, another woman joined. And in my third year, another woman came back from one of the Scottish universities and joined. So there were 3 in my year. By that stage, I was the 12th woman ordained. So I'm the 12th disciple, if you like.
Oh, I didn't know that. And whenever you completed your training, how did you find, where you were going to go? How did you feel called? Or were there churches very open to women ministers at that time? Because it must have been very new.
Going into Union College, and going back to your question, Will, about the trailblazing, for me it was the most natural thing in the world. Coming into Union College, it was a big shock to discover it wasn't actually the most natural thing in the world, and that people had various opinions about it. Now, had I met various opinions when I was in England? Yes, I had, but not with the same intensity as I discovered them in Union College. So when I came into Union College, I found people who were not only discursively opposed, but rigidly opposed to the ordination of women. And that was a big shock to my system, because I had only one question in my mind, which was, am I on the path I believe God wants me to be on? And if the answer to that is yes, I didn't really ask any more questions. It was as simple as that for me. But for other people, there were other questions. So keeping that in mind, sudden discovery of lots of opposition to varying degrees. When we came then to the point in our second and third year of being placed into a congregation as an assistant, which we would be in our system, and you would learn the trade, if you like, or the calling or the vocation within a congregational setting under the guidance of a senior minister. When it came to that, I know I was on edge. So the men would have been talking about where they would like to go, and they had a lot of choice, and they would have known all the congregations that would take an assistant, and they would have discussed all of them because all of those were open to them. All of those were not open to me. Yes. Or to the women. So some congregations simply would not have taken a woman as an assistant. So that was a challenging time. And I suppose in my mind there was always a worry that there would be nobody who would take me. And there were 3 of us to place that year, so that was challenging enough. I was placed into Rosemary Congregation in North Belfast with the Reverend Dr. John Dunlop. Again, a challenging experience, totally different world than I grew up in. I grew up in a small country congregation. You step into Rosemary Church and you can set my church inside it 3 times potentially. There are lots of people, they sing different music, they do things differently, they're ordered in a different way.
Rows and rows of suburban streets in North Belfast.
Absolutely, totally different than I grew up in. So never mind the woman business. There was the culture of urban and rural and all of that going on as well. And then when your assistantship's finished, you go looking for a call or what you really hope is that a congregation will come looking for you, actually, guided there by the Lord to your door to call you to be their own. And of course, that didn't happen. So there was a difficult time. And I was very blessed to be in Rosemary, to be honest. And John was moderator when I was there, so I got to stay extra time anyway. And I was very, very happy to stay extra time. I was never in any rush out to my own congregation at all. But nothing seemed to come along. And even though I had discussed with some congregations the possibility, there wasn't anything emerging, and I wasn't the only woman experiencing that, of course. And then ultimately there were 2 choices came along at the same time, and I had to decide which one, and I ended up in McCrory Memorial, which down the road from Rosemary, not miles away, geographically not miles away, but emotionally an eternity away. And in terms of the experience of those people, very different as well. So I was glad to go there after 5 years in Rosemary. And they didn't have any concerns about whether you were male or female. They had female elders. They had people of mixed denomination, etc., etc. So that this just wasn't a question for them. But for the local community, it was an interesting experience.
And throughout all that, because I mean, I know how I felt as the first woman, and in fact the only woman ever to have worked for the Irish Mission of the Presbyterian Church.
Yes.
What support did you have? Who was there to offer some support in terms of what you were going through?
I suppose as a Presbyterian, we find a lot of support within our own congregation or not. And I was blessed to find it inside the congregation. So the McCrory congregation were great friends. That experience of that first congregation for me could never be matched, and has never been matched. It has been complemented. It has been built on. There have been parallel or different experiences which are just as good, but the actual experience of being brought in, loved, nurtured, challenged, all of that in that first congregation, it just could never be matched. So I found a lot of support inside the congregation. My family were supportive, even though from the very beginning my mother was anxious, very anxious for me, that I would run up against too many challenges and it would be tough. But my family were very supportive, and Some of the Rosemary folks would have been there as well. We kept in touch. We shared summer club activities, etc., etc. That was also very useful. The women met from time to time, but not in a desperately ordered way, because the last thing we wanted to do was to be seen as a lobby group or a pressure group. Therefore, that was very difficult. We did move to being much more organised, myself and another of the women ministers, we organised regular get-togethers. We also moved those into regular engagements with a group of men who were not in favour of the ordination of women. So we had a little campaign, actually. I don't know if I've ever said this in public or not, but we had a little campaign of identifying ministers who were opposed to the ordination of women, who said helpful and useful things about anything under the sun, not about women, particularly at the General Assembly, and we would always drop them a note and thank them for that. I'm sure at times it was painful to receive a note from some of us, but nevertheless,
being forced to be gracious is terrible, isn't it?
we decided that was a good way to go, so we'd done that. So we gathered up, and I'm grateful to some of the people who were publicly opposed to the ordination of women, who were willing to take that step. And we would have had lunch, we would have had conversation, and that was really, really useful relationship building, and I think sustained PCI through some of its challenges and difficulties. And I don't think that network exists today to sustain PCI through some of the difficulties it has. PCI, Presbyterian Church in Ireland,
There was one more congregation, wasn't there?
Yes, after McCrory, well, it depends how you describe it. Well, after McCrory Memorial, I went to Fort William Park, which again, just back up the road between Rosemary and McCrory, and into there. And then after a time, it became evident that Fort William needed to think about joining with another congregation, and McCrory was free, looking also to join with another congregation. So we successfully amalgamated the two congregations, which is a wonderful, for me it was just a wonderful thing to experience, to know both those congregations, to see them integrating together. They did an absolutely amazing job of integrating themselves, working out. There's a lot of practical things to do when congregations amalgamate and become one congregation. Who's going to be the BB captain? Which captain are you going to choose?
Who's going to be clerk of session?
Who's going to be the organist?
Who's going to be the treasurer?
All those decisions have to get made, but they're all important opportunities for making the new congregation work. So we really applied ourselves to handling that in a very collaborative way, and it was a very successful amalgamation. So yes, McCrory Memorial, Fort William Park, and then Fort William and McCrory.
But there came a time when you said, I'm going to go and do something else and not be a full-time minister anymore.
Yeah.
Big deal. Tell us what you did and why.
I think I reached the point of exhaustion and didn't really know what to do. And I did have a conversation with the Clerk of the General Assembly at the time about whether it would be possible to do something like being seconded out to another role. And I had somebody had approached me about a different role. And if I did that, how would I come back? And that was very difficult because, of course, you're seconded out of a job to come back into it. And that couldn't be guaranteed. And taking a sabbatical wasn't going to work because sabbaticals had become so organised and engineered in PCI that actually they're a task in themselves, and that's not what I needed. I didn't need more of the same. I didn't need more theology, etc. I needed a break. And I needed to just have space to think different things and experience some different things. I was physically exhausted as well as mentally exhausted, and probably experiencing some trauma from some of the experiences that I'd lived through as well. And in the end, I didn't think I had any alternative but to take some other kind of job for a while. So I went to work at Victim Support, which supports victims of crime, all kinds of victims of crime. Nice little desk job. no responsibilities, go home in the evening, not have to worry, get your knee replacement done while you're there, all those kinds of things. And it was a wonderful recovery job, but also a job where I learned so many things which were connected to many of my previous experiences as well, being in and out of prisons, for example, with members of the congregation, and understanding what that meant, or living through domestic violence situations with members of the congregation. And here we were seeing that in a different setting, etc. And then after a couple of years, I moved on into the prisons world.
But at that time as well, Leslie, you also seemed to be, I don't know, being used to be a voice or to be speaking into some of the more difficult legacy type issues. Was it not at that time that you were doing that?
So, yes, I was a member of the Northern Ireland Victims Forum for a while as an advisory member. They don't have that role anymore, but there would have been three of us as kind of in an advisory role, and my role was specifically around dealing with the past. So yes, I'd been doing that work, and previously I'd been a member of the consultative group on dealing with the past. You mentioned David Porter.
She said
there.
Nonchalantly.
Yeah.
That was a pretty big deal.
It was a great time now, I have to say, and a great experience, and David was on it as well, David Porter. So I'd had that interest all along, and I'd also been interested in victims and survivors and helped with the early setup of WAVE, for example. I'd been involved in some engagements with paramilitaries and politicians. You couldn't avoid that if you were involved in the community in North Belfast at all. And all of that, was around at that time as well. And I suppose I was a bit lost in direction. When I say I was exhausted, I was exhausted. Part of that exhaustion was not knowing, am I still in the right place, or where the next place to go to is. And I wasn't clear about any of that. And there was no space to just step back and find that reflective time, which is how I ended up at victim support.
But you were experienced in being a pastor, so you knew how to listen.
Yeah.
And you knew how to read people. And here you are dealing with really scary grown-up stuff.
Yeah.
You're dealing with people talking about situations where there has been hatred, there has been violence, there has been murder, there has been intimidation, there has been lives destroyed, and saying, how do we build a society out of that? I mean, that people love to know that that's going on. It's a very different kind of person, I think, that says, I'm going to try to be part of it, even though I don't know how I'm going to do it. And that's what you did.
Yeah, I suppose that's one way of putting it. Well, I hadn't really thought of it in those terms, but I'll go back to the sense of vocation that I had at my very naive 17 years old. I mean, the one thing I knew from growing up in the Coal Island area was that there was trouble in Northern Ireland. And I had seen friends murdered and buried, basically. And I went to a congregation where that was never discussed. And it wasn't, to my memory, that is, it was never addressed from the pulpit. So when Gertie and Jim Devlin, who were ordinary SDLP members, were both shot dead simply for being SDLP and Catholic, I knew them very well. When they were shot dead, and it was never mentioned inside the walls of the congregation in which I worshipped, I couldn't understand that.
Yeah, because that's not normal.
It wasn't normal to me. And I would have wanted, at that stage in my life, to be thinking about how do we make this place better as the Church of Jesus Christ? After all, we've got this peacemaker stuff going on, blessed are the peacemakers and all of that. So I couldn't marry that up in my head, and my sense of vocation, arrogant and all as it sounds now, was also about reconciliation, and that was an integral part of the vocation for me. It wasn't only about saving souls or preaching the gospel or looking after the sick or building up a congregation. It was also for me about doing something or making a contribution to a better Northern Ireland.
You could see that even in the group of women that gathered together, because you were the ones reaching out to those who were opposed. So, no matter what, you seem to have been involved in that. Can you tell us a wee bit more about what it was like being on that group and dealing with the legacy of the past? Because it was obviously really important at the time, but it was sort of, what happened in the end was there was a big focus on the payment rather than all of the other good stuff that was in the document, and that must have been hugely frustrating.
Yes. So the group reported in 2009, the consultative group on dealing with the past, just to sketch in a wee bit of history for people.
Yes.
It was chaired by Robin Eames and Dennis Bradley. And then we were a mixed group of what might have been called do-gooders. Thereafter, somebody did call us that in the press. And, it was interesting how many of us did have an interest in theology, for example. So there was a shared connection, I suppose, between us. And the one thing we said to each other at the beginning was, let's not fall out. And if we ever get to that point of people feeling, or anyone in the group feeling that they can't go with where the group's going, then we need to have a discussion about it. So we made that kind of pledge early on to each other, and actually while we had heated discussions and disagreed on some matters, we never left a meeting without regard to one another's feelings and thoughts and without goodwill to each other. And I don't know how we managed it, but we did manage it, which is incredible. It was a really intense experience in that we consulted widely. So we went out to people all over the place with big public events. We met with hundreds of groups. We received thousands of letters and submissions. I diligently read everything and attended as much as I could. And then we wrote the report at the end of it, which was our best guess at what would work. It wasn't what we thought should happen. It was our best guess, having listened to the wide spectrum of people we'd listened to. It was our best guess at what would work. You're quite right that the payment became the headline. And perhaps we agreed the payment quite early on, actually.
This was the payment to families of victims.
It was a recognition payment, yes. And it was mirroring. It was for everyone in Northern Ireland, and it was to be, I think maybe it was the victims in the end. Well, you could be right.
Victims, I think.
Yeah, because we talked about it being everybody in the same way as the Irish Republic had done something previously.
And yet so many took it as a huge insult.
An insult, and I understand why. I do understand why. At the end, we were rushed, and we probably on reflection should have reviewed more, and we did ask for a few more months before we would report, and I reckon we might have reviewed. And I don't know of course I have no idea what we would have said had we reviewed it. But it did hijack the headline. Of course, if people hadn't wanted a hijacking headline, they wouldn't have gone there. So I would suggest that they may have wanted a hijacking headline. And that's absolutely fine. Maybe we weren't ready at that point. I think it is fair to say that the report the group produced has provided the framework for the legacy debate ever since. So Stormont House, or whatever other agreement it might be, even the current legislation, which is disputed, of course, it is all around the same framework as the group in the past had proposed. So I think we did something for society. I don't think we did everything by any means. And I suppose we could confidently say that we brought people into the debate. So I do, for example, I often reflect back to some of the people we met in those years who were speaking for the very first time about their experience. And now they would be in the vanguard of speaking out and helping others to speak out. So I think there was something there that we achieved.
We're going to come back to attempts to deal with our past as they're happening now. And as you've said, they're still disputed. But I do want to brush over a couple of other things you did. Deputy Chief Commissioner at the Equality Commission, Prisoner Ombudsman. These are big grown-up jobs, Leslie.
Well, the Equality Commission post. So I actually had that post also while I was in a congregation, same as when the group on the past. So I was still in Fort William McCrory when I went to the Equality Commission, and there was a big driver of curiosity there for me. So I had been a member of the Presbyterian Church's Church and Government Committee, which is now its Church and Society Committee, I think. For years, I was on that committee, far longer than you're ever meant to be. But because I kept shifting roles, I got to stay, which was fabulous. So I'd been a member, and then I was also co-convener of that group. So I was interested in these society issues because that's what the job was about. And I was particularly interested in the societal pillars that were put in place by the Belfast Good Friday Agreement in order to framework a better society for the future. And the Equality Commission was one of those pillars. Human Rights Commission, for example, was another. So there were a few around there. And I knew that in PCI, some of those equality issues were highly disputed. So I said to myself, when I saw that job, I said, wouldn't that be interesting to understand how the Equality Commission actually works? So that was my driver. I wanted to know how it worked rather than just pitching the differences that we had all the time. So I did not expect to be successful, I have to say. It's probably the interview I was least prepared for in all of my life. When I arrived at the interview, I couldn't find a parking space, so I had to haul up the hill at Stormont and hardly had a breath by the time I arrived into the interview. So I absolutely did not expect to get that role at all, and was delighted when I did. And that was a completely different experience than anything I'd ever had. And I realised how ill-prepared parish ministers are for the world of decision-making, chairing meetings, and now the world that parish ministers have to deal with around charity legislation, for example, and all the requirements that are placed on the shoulders
which
of senior leaders. Which you've also been
involved in looking at.
Yeah.
So again, you know what you're talking about. Did that experience challenge any of your beliefs or your core assumptions?
So I came to understand the difference between a personal opinion and an opinion, or a decision rather, not an opinion, a decision that had to be made within the bounds of a legislative framework. So we can all have a personal opinion, but when you're sitting on a body like the Equality Commission, you are constrained and helpfully boundaried by legislation which guides you. And you make the decision in light of that framework. Your personal opinion may at times not sit with that. And therefore my view would have been, if I reach the position where the decision is so at odds with my personal conviction as a Christian, then I might have to consider resigning that role because the legislation doesn't bend. That's how I approached it.
And then you moved on to working for, or being the prisoner ombudsman.
Yep.
What was it that attracted you to that? I know you said obviously you'd worked with offenders in congregational life, but the prisoner ombudsman's role was challenging enough because I joined you very briefly during COVID.
You did, to help us out. Thank you for that, Diane. I have always been fascinated by prisons. I don't know what that tells you about me, but it probably tells you something. And it was exciting and terrifying to go into the Maze prison for the first time. But it was also, for me, enticing. And I wanted to understand more about prison life. Now, it was very different then than it is now. So you were driven around in the Maze prison in a van with windows all closed up. It was quite nauseating, actually. Couldn't see where you were going. So it was very different than it is now. But to listen to the guys who were inside talking about what life was like on the inside was also fascinating, and I just was totally hooked on that. And then about 2010, I think, David Ford, as the Minister of Justice, invited me to be part of a small group of people who would regularly visit dissident Republican prisoners. So I did that over a number of years. We would have been in every month to meet with them. And that was about trying to generate the type of environment on the landing on which they lived that was safe for everyone, for prison officers and prisoners alike. So that was all about relationships and what people's needs were. People understood themselves, obviously, to be different than other prisoners. With
back
that
on a little bit, though. The first time you walk into a room, how much is there? Who are you? What do you want? Why are you coming to see me? Or is it like a committee where I've got a list of meetings? Or is it suspicious? Or is there wariness? Or are you stalking round each other metaphorically and working out where there's a gap? I'm fascinated. Every journalist would want to know, how on earth was that room made into something when you've got to do the first walk in the door and everybody looks at everybody else?
Yeah. So we were privileged to be able to go down onto the landing to meet those prisoners. So that was great.
So right outside their cells?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So there was nothing contrived in that sense. They were in their comfort zone. We were in one of their
and it was a separate area?
Yes. So they're called separated landings, yes. So dissident Republican and Loyalist prisoners still have some separated landings, and there's good reason for that. And yeah, so we were allowed to go down onto the landing, which was amazing. So two of the guys on the group, there were four of us, knew the guys inside very well. So I was in their hands, if you like, as a newcomer. And of course there's always a bit of testing out, who are you and what are you here for, and the limits of your tolerance and all that kind of thing. That's all very normal for prison life. But the conversations had to be constructive, so we had to stick to building the relationships and dealing with the issues that continued to present themselves. So over a number of years I was doing that and engaging with the Director General of the Prison Service regularly as well, and that just fed my already existing little fascination around prison life and why people end up in prison, and is there nothing that we can do further up the pipeline to subvert that. And I think the fascination is connected back to my early congregational life. And I remember at that Foster Memorial Hall that I'd been talking about earlier in Cool Island, two elderly ladies used to come to church on a Sunday evening, and I used to go with Dad as a child, really. And I remember once saying to Dad, why do they always sit in the back row? And I didn't get an answer because, you don't get answers in Presbyterian households sometimes. And, they just do. They just do. Well, later I discovered that was the mother and the aunt of two people who had committed an act of terrorism against a group of Catholics. And that these two young men who had committed the act of terrorism had come up through what was then the Life Boys, ahead of the BB, Boys Brigade, with my mother and father, who set up and ran the Life Boys in New Mills Presbyterian. So I think my fascination began back then. What is it that leads two young men who are sent to church, brought to church, come up through the church organisations, have good leadership, they're well known, they're well loved, they could be well supported through that network, and that's where they end up. And I think that's where the fascination began, because that's not how it should be. If the church is doing its job, that's not how it should be. So fast forward then to all these other opportunities were just an opportunity for me again to follow something that was a curiosity for me. How did this happen? Where did we go wrong as the church? Was there something we could have done better? I often use that kind of stark language where did we go wrong? I shouldn't really be that stark about it. What did we fail to learn? What did we fail to do? Where had we missed something? And that all for me was about learning that and trying to do better by the people who ended up in jail.
So at one end of the spectrum is the people themselves, the actual valuable human being there that, you know, we're meant to be thriving and flourishing as individuals. That's how God wants us to be. But at the other end, you're really interested in challenging and changing systems that are broken. That seems to me to be, you go into different places to see if there's something that, yes, you can understand, but it must be that you want to try and change mindsets, change, what is it that you feel that you can do in those places?
Well, I don't really set out to do that much, to be honest. I suppose I think that people who are not flourishing, as you describe it, and thriving to the full potential that they could, that there's something somebody failed them around. And it could be the church, it could be the education system, it could be the political system, it could be anything under the sun. But I suppose if I mean, I've never put words on it, so it's a struggle for me. But if I was trying to put words on it, I might be saying something like, people need to know there's always an opportunity to do something different or be something different. And certainly for people in jail, and I'm not talking about just dissident Republicans, I'm talking generally, people so often have just lost a sense of who they could have become. And it's not that they've lost a dream. Maybe they do have a dream, but they don't have the tools to get themselves there. And that's society's failure, do you know.
I'm going to bring it back to attempts now in Northern Ireland to deal with the past. Because, here we go, we still haven't sorted it out. So you now work for the Independent Commission for Reconciliation and Information Recovery. We're going to get an idea of what you do in a minute, but I've got to address this. Loads of people, you said it was disputed, political parties, campaign groups, very, very opposed to the ICRIR. You know that, and yet you still went in and said, I'm going to try and do something here.
Well, that's true, but I didn't go in easily. And I suppose I resisted for a long time, partly because that world is difficult to live in, and it does have an impact on people working in the area. It certainly had an impact on me, and that is not in any way to blame anybody. That is just to acknowledge the reality that where there is trauma, there will be more trauma because of the way people are impacted. So whenever the ICRIR, the commission as we call it, was proposed and the legislation was floated, and there was, of course, recruitment companies out looking for people to apply for roles, like the commissioner roles, for example. And I said to myself, I don't want to go back there. I'm just not interested. I couldn't face it. Don't want to do it again. There'll be somebody who'll do it better than me. So all of the high-flying commissioner roles, board roles were all appointed, and I wasn't really looking for a career as such. I mean, I'm sort of at the far end of all of that. I was looking for something that would generate the income I still need to live. And along came this job. My ombudsman's role was coming to an end. Along came this job at the Commission, which was about building a trauma-informed organisation and making sure that victims and survivors were properly supported. And it seemed an opportunity that I couldn't resist. So I threw in an application. Again, you're just, I mean, all of that is, in any of these roles, you're floating out what you think is maybe a potential direction in which your life should go, and that's always in somebody else's hands to decide. So I was appointed to that role. Our job inside the Commission is to make the very best that we can make of it for the victims and survivors of the Troubles conflict, which we have all lived through. And that's what I'm there to do.
Do you not feel you're in a bunker sometimes? Because every single political party had a right will go at the legislation and the Commission. inevitably in my career I met all sorts of campaign groups. There's not one, and I still get a lot of their round-robin messages, there's not one who speaks well of the Commission. That's really difficult to be part of something when you have that kind of opposition and you're earnestly, for good reasons, trying to do good.
I think that's fair comment, Will, and from the point of view of staff working inside the Commission, if I'm turning a trauma-informed lens onto things, and we have a trauma and resiliency-informed model operating now, so if I'm turning that lens onto exactly what you've described there, not a good word about the Commission, I can expect staff to feel that they can't do anything right. That would be the natural outworking of that in the trauma world. And it is tough, therefore, being trauma-informed is not just about supporting the people coming forward. It has also to be about supporting the staff inside the Commission, and that's very important. I don't think I've ever stepped into a place where people were more committed to doing something good, or more hopeful that they could, and all being of the same mind. And that was an impressive thing to step into. That, however, has to tolerate, if you like, all that opposition. And so far, we're managing our way through that.
You have to be really passionate about this resiliency and trauma, and I know that you are.
Yeah.
But I don't think there's people maybe who are listening who understand what you're talking about in terms of supporting, that model. Or can you just very concisely try and tease out a little bit about what it is that you're trying to introduce?
So there will be a video on the Commission's website, which you can watch, which will help you to understand the framework that we're now working out of. So I think the big learning around trauma for me over the last number of years is the way in which it not only impacts individuals but also impacts systems. And it's interesting how you referenced systems earlier. So every system can expect to mirror something of the people it engages with, and therefore we will mirror the world that we engage with, which is a world of deep trauma, deep division, dispute, where one group of people feels that if they get what they want, others won't get what they want. There's all that competition in there as well. So what I'm trying to do, and what the Commission is trying to do, is to first of all hold carefully victims and survivors through the investigative process in a way that reduces their risk of re-traumatisation. What does that mean? That means we look at the physical environment, we look at how we train our staff so that they understand how to read how trauma is impacting an individual, and to bring them back into the balance that they need in order to engage well with the Commission. People have been very brave, courageous, coming forward to the Commission in the first place. Our job is to help them to stay engaged, because that's their choice and that's their decision. If they choose to move out again, that also is their choice. But as long as they're with us, our job is to help them to be there in the least traumatising way possible. But in order to do that, I have to address the well-being of the people within the Commission who engage with those people. And that's about training them to attend to their own resilience and well-being. It's about training them to recognise when trauma is impacting their own way of behaving, way of thinking, etc. And also training them to notice that they might have had traumatic experiences apart from being within the Commission, which are influencing how they're working within the Commission. So there's a lot of training involved, a lot of bringing stuff to people's minds and to understand. And it's not just then the staff who are at frontline who will reflect that, what's going on in the world outside. It is all of the staff. So you can imagine if you work in HR, for example, if frontline staff are unhappy, frustrated, anxious because of what they're engaging with, then that'll go back into the HR department. So the HR department will be affected. So the whole Commission has to, as a system, take on board a well-being approach and build a culture that will allow people to notice when they're experiencing the trauma and turn their focus to being more resilient. And we are training people in a set of skills to do that. And we're developing that training differently for different groups and different times within the Commission. And ultimately, it is really important that I say this, ultimately it is all about ensuring that journey for victims and survivors through the investigative process is the very best that it can be.
All of us here, just about everybody listening, young and old, knows that trauma can either percolate or cascade down generations. Do you have a vision in your mind that at some stage the ICRIR will have done its work and it won't be needed anymore, and we draw a line under all this? What will have been done? In very simple terms, what will have been done by then, if that day ever comes?
So the legislation very clearly sets out that the ICRIR has a beginning and an end, and that is sensible. How that all plays out in reality remains to be seen. I don't think that anybody in the Commission, and certainly speaking personally, I don't think it would be fair to say that we should then consider that that's the line drawn. That we don't draw the lines, other people draw the lines, or people draw the lines for themselves, or they come to terms with their past, or they learn to live with as much information as they've got. So certainly the internal narrative of the Commission is not about drawing lines onto the past. It is about getting as much information as we can to the victims and survivors who are coming forwards with questions. And that's the real driver internally of the Commission. And the legislation empowers us to do that.
So, Leslie, Inspired to Act is about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And you are Leslie, the wee girl from Coal Island. But you've done some pretty extraordinary things. We're really keen to encourage others to just take some steps. And I ask this of every guest. So what would you say to people who are listening to this podcast about how they might do something to make a difference within their own small sphere of influence?
That's a really hard question in so many ways. Partly because, well, there isn't a recipe for a start off, but also partly because I just did what I saw to do. And that, I think, potentially is the answer I might give you. If you see something to do, then do it. Why did I do it? I often think about that. The main scriptural driver for me, if you like, from my childhood and teenage years was love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And somehow I translated that into I'd better be talking to my enemies all the time. So that was the driver in so many instances. If there was an opportunity to meet an enemy, however you defined that enemy, whether it was the Equality Commission and a theological belief, or a Republican and a political belief, or whatever, meeting the enemy was the important thing for me. That's how I translated it in my mind. Other people will translate things in different ways, but the driver for me was most certainly that simple piece of scripture and my belief that my life has to follow a pathway that is in harmony with the will of God for my future. So if there's something people feel they could do, don't hold back. Don't be shy.
Yeah, have a go.
Have a go.
Take that first step.
Yeah, absolutely.
Leslie, thank you so much. It's been really fascinating. And I mean, I've known you for a while, but it's so good to hear that sort of wider spectrum. Thank you.
Thank you for being so candid.
Thanks,
and for
Bill.
saying things that you've never said
Thank
before.
you.
And we're privileged, so thank you. That's it from Inspired to Act for this time. Make sure you follow us on your podcast app. Tell your friends. Every episode so far is there and is staying there. And you can send us a message. You can now text us via the podcast apps. Tell us what you think.
But be nice. You can find out more about Thrive Ireland and how to support us on thriveIreland.org and on our Facebook and Instagram page and YouTube channel. And we've just launched a new campaign which you'll find on those channels called Give 5 to Thrive.
We'll be back soon. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.
Bye.